It's Jjballance. I'd like to thank the Institute for asking me to give the lecture. I understand that you specialise in electronic engineering, mechanical and environmental. I'm by training a civil structural engineer, so don't expect me to answer too many technical questions about electronics or whatever. But I'm chairman of Bruce Shaw Project Management, and as a result of that, over the last 20, 25 years or so, I've dealt with every type of engineer known to man. And so I hope I have some insights to give to you. So the first thing I'd like to talk about is the essentials of an engineering education. I think that engineering education is a wonderful intellectual discipline. It is a terrific discipline altogether. And I'll talk later about society's attitude to engineers. I don't think it's played up enough in Irish society, but it's a fantastic training. And fundamentally, to go on the next thing, you're trained to look at cause and effect. That's what you are there to do. Like, what happens when you do this? How do you prevent something happening? That's the challenges that come to you as engineers. The next thing, you learn how to address problems, and there are a series of stages. And it's quite interesting. I looked this up, and it's the stages in engineering, and by sheer fluke, it also happens to be the stages in military planning. So there must be something there about it. And obviously, it's the way to solve difficult problems. So you start off by reconnaissance, and I can't emphasize enough to you as engineers, the original brief for whatever problem you have is the most important stage in all that you will ever do. And there are more messy projects, there are more failed inventions and so on by people not getting the bloody well brief right. And you must have the courage to say, I don't quite understand what you're looking for, because we end up with clients coming in looking for things, and we have got to question them, pin them back to find exactly what they're talking about. And once you have that done, you can then move on to the next one, which is solution proposals. And it's interesting, we tend sometimes not to think of engineers the way we do of architects as original thinkers, but original thinking is absolutely prime. It applies in everything we do. It doesn't matter whether you're talking about manufacturing, building, electronics, or whatever. Original thinking is a wonderful gift, and it's something you will have developed some of it here, but you'll develop more of it as you move on to the actual practical application of engineering. And one of the things you need in original thinking is courage. One of the things I would say, there isn't enough emphasis in education about what I would call general kind of psychological things that you need to survive in life and in a professional career. And courage is one of them. Like, there are more fiascos again where people sit and people feel, oh, it's not my job to say, that the king has no clothes. They sit there, something's being considered, and they kind of feel, it's not my job to comment. Have the courage to do it. And I think one of the greatest gifts you'll ever have in life is the guts to ask stupid questions. It takes courage to do that, and I think it's frightfully important for engineers. So the next one then is the analysis of options, including costs. And there's one definition of an engineer, and that's a professional who can solve a problem for 20 euros that any idiot can solve for 100. And it is so true, you can cross a river by piling heaps and heaps of stones and so on into it. It's the reason that we as engineers work is that we produce something that is cost effective and efficient. So that whole thing about cost permeates everything we do, and you have to get it. And I think engineers are much better than a lot of other people in having a consciousness of cost, both costs in use and cost to develop things. The next one then is decision, and this again is back to the psychological thing that I was saying, that you reach a point where everything in life is like this, that you've got options and they are never quite open and shut. You'll get A, B, C, D, and it turns out C and D are pretty close to one another. And you have to have the courage and conviction yourself to put them forward. And above all, you need the technical ability and the personal ability to persuade people to go with you. Like, you will be working as engineers with other professionals, and you'll be working with clients. And that whole thing about persuasion and ability is a very important thing, as well as the technical knowledge. The next one then is implementation, which there's an awful lot about project management and so on. And frankly, I would nearly take that for granted, that if we're not engineers and we can't go, having decided the solution to a problem, having decided the way to tackle it, and having sorted out the cost, we should be shot if we can't go and do the blooming thing within the budget and within the program. So very important to get it, write it all down and so on, but it's not the most challenging thing. It's the other bits that I talked about, the brief, the personality and the application. The next thing then, which is something that has really developed. When I was a young man, there was no feedback. You just did jobs and disappeared. We would never do a project now without a great session with all the people involved, client people, all the rest of it, in an environment like this. And we go through honestly, what did we do right, what did we do wrong, what can we do better? And I think it's a fantastic compliment about modern life and about how open young people are, and actually how open society is, that you can sit in there and hear somebody saying, well, you made a right mess out of that, and you have to stand up and say, you're quite correct, and I think the next time around we should do this, that, or the other. So as far as I'm concerned, I consider engineering to be a wonderful career. And then I'd ask the question, what does society think of engineering? So different countries have a different view of the importance of engineering in society. If you turn to the next one, in Germany, I used to go an awful lot. I did a lot of work in Britain for General Motors, and they operated from a headquarters in Frankfurt. In Germany, if you're an engineer, you were introduced as Herr Engineer Balance or Herr Engineer O'Boyle or whatever. It is a society permeated with respect for technical things, and you see it in the products. It's a very, very powerful engineering, deep engineering culture ethos. Similarly in France, it's quite astonishing. I thought the French were all kind of like mad, emotional Mediterraneans and so on. They are not that at all. They are the most legalistic, finicky people you will ever deal with in your life. But I'll have to say this about them, they really have a very high regard, and their polytechnics, the equivalent of you here, they are the premier educational institutions. They are way above the universities and so on. So they, again, have a very high regard. And I did work in Belgium and Holland, and I found they were very, very similar in their outlook. The United States is very much a society where engineering and technical achievement and the whole thing about gimmicks and new ideas, it permeates the whole society, and they have a great ethos for rewarding effort. You can go and fail in business 6 times, and if you start again, they say good on you. Where in Ireland there was a terrible tendency. You started off in something and you failed it, good God, you're hopeless, don't ever try it again. But Americans are wonderful, and we've worked over the years with various large American companies, people like Abbott Laboratories, and the corporate engineering are God. They rule the roost. The marketing guys get out and get products, but what the corporate engineers come up with and their ideas and how they apply it and so on is absolutely, what they say goes. And it's a wonderful environment to work as a fellow professional. I'm not saying it's easy. It isn't easy. With Americans, we found they question everything. You end up as an expert on every aspect, mechanical, electrical, sprinklers, you name it, and you've got to battle your way through. But in those big people like Abbott, they're rather like the Japanese. You end up with a consensus approach, and people don't bitch. You've decided to go with option A, everyone backs option A, and it's a terrific way to get things done. England, unfortunately, I actually lived outside London, but I spent a lot of time in Ireland. It's a society where, in fact, technical prowess and engineering has moved right back. It's amazing. Their manufacturing base hasn't actually disappeared. It's quite astonishing. They're exporting more cars from Britain now than they did 20 years ago. But because they're Japanese cars, they don't seem to give themselves the credit for that. And above all, when I was a young man and went there, even if I would have been back in the 60s and 70s, there was a lot of engineering companies around and so on, but they have all moved into the background. They are now beginning to realize that maybe they threw out the baby with the bathwater, and they're beginning to come back to it. So what's happened is we've ended up in manufacturing that the moronic simple stuff, the relatively simple stuff, has gone off to the Far East and so on. But the complicated, sophisticated manufacturing is still here, and Germany's the prime example. They produce the stuff and they can go and sell it anywhere in the world. So England, as I say, unfortunately, Ireland, in my judgment, has been somewhat similar to England. This whole kind of idea of doing courses in politics and so on. And you see it, there just weren't the numbers doing engineering. But it's interesting, one of the results of the recession is a realization, that a lot of this kind of puffed up bubble about property and all the rest of it isn't actually producing wealth. Wealth is produced by going and producing some wonderful product and going and selling it out in the world. And we are very good at that in Ireland. We really, really are. But we've wakened up to the fact that we need to do more of that. And then we need, going back up the line, go to the scientists, start investigating new ways of doing things, move it back to the engineers, and we end up producing the products that make the money. So I would have to say, I do think we're in a happier era now where there is more appreciation for science and engineering. Okay, the benefits then, I would say, of an engineering education, there's certain third level courses, of which engineering is one, which you're capable of being used for entry directly into a profession. I mean, if you do a BA or whatever, you may go into teaching, but you can go into all kinds of one. But engineering is very fortunate that you can go straight into a career, which is terrific. And the present market, unfortunately, I discussed it with various recruitment firms, and I'm sure you guys, ladies here, probably know about that yourselves. But it was interesting that their general comment was that electronic engineering is a major area of growth and seems to be doing quite well, particularly jobs in automation. In mechanical engineering, they were saying actually there are reasonable job prospects, but particularly in production, they felt that the actual payment for the jobs wasn't particularly high. And then when you move, of course, to the next one, which is the environmental engineering, the huge collapse in construction has meant that all the jobs for environmental engineers out in the whole development area have largely vanished, and we're just having a very, very rough time at the moment. So I think what you have to do is look at what other options do you have. And I would say, for a good example would be law. A lot of people do law and they never practice, they never become barristers or whatever. They use it as a broad-based education and they go into business or whatever. And I don't see why engineers can't do this. You know, it's a good broad-based course. What's wrong with going? And we need to alter our own approach and also society's approach. Believe it or not, some of the accountants who recruit at graduate level have recruited engineers, and their comments to me was that they found the quality of the engineers and their input absolutely first rate. So an example of the difference on the continent, when I worked in Belgium, I dealt with this property company, and the head of marketing had a degree in mechanical engineering, and no one passed the slightest comment. It wasn't considered odd or peculiar or whatever. It just said, well, he's an educated person. You know, why shouldn't he have a job there? So I think there should be more of this in Ireland, and engineering graduates should be encouraged to seek opportunities in a broader field than just their own immediate area. Now, it's important to differentiate the different aspirations. Like there are people who love the technical side, really, really love it. And again, it even applies to going on to do management courses. Like I would describe the real technical professional as someone who is looking for, literally that word, perfection. And they tend to be very demanding both on themselves and people around them, and they get the real satisfaction out of that. When you go into management, you tend to operate on a percentage basis. You will not get 100%, and different personalities can work in those different areas. So you find someone with the what I call the technical perfectionist is a bad manager. They tend to be poor at delegating and so on. They want to do it all themselves, keep it under control. And then equally, the manager mentality is not good at the technical perfection side of things. One of the things we should do, I think, and I include myself in this as a profession, is we should try to encourage employers to take a much broader view of engineers and how they might use them. The next thing I wanted to talk about then was further training. In the 21st century, all of you, every single one of you, will do another course. Like, it's just, there's no debate. You will do a further postgraduate course of some sort in your career. Like the days when you got your degree and off you went and you were landed are completely gone. These courses, they could be under the aegis of your employer, and fortunately a lot of employers are terrific now at further training and so on, or you may end up entertaining yourselves. The type of course you do, of course, will vary with your own original discipline and obviously your own choices and preferences. And I talked there earlier about the specialists. There'll be people who do specialist engineering courses because that's their thing, and then there's people who go on, for example, to do management. And I mentioned this here, there'll be some who will take the engineering management route. For example, it's quite interesting, I work in a firm, Brushaw, which are, it's largely 200 people, and they're nearly all quantity surveyors, but in the project management, they're all engineers. We have no one other than engineers in the project management, which is quite interesting. And the other thing about management that I would say is I think management is something that you should bear in mind if you have that mentality, because there's a lot of graduate courses, undergraduate courses in management, and like I think it's again a contradiction in terms. I don't think you can learn about management if you haven't learned about a basic professional, technical kind of process. You know, in other words, you must go out and actually work and operate with people and so on before you start to learn about management. And I think management is the perfect postgraduate course. I think the ideal is to work for a number of years and then with that experience join a number of equally experienced fellow graduates in a postgraduate course. I mean, anyone that I know that's ever done this, and they've done all kinds of things, town planning, commerce, you name it, they find they get more from their fellow postgraduate students learn, and from their experience, they find it terrific, and it opens them out in terms of their future career prospects and also their own interests. So my advice for engineers, if you're thinking, if you will be doing a course, but if you want to do it, work for a number of years and then do a postgraduate course from which you can steer your career perhaps in a different direction. Right, this is like don't mention the war kind of thing. The recession. So from 2007 to 2010, we suffered 3 dreadful things in parallel. And unfortunately, it's very difficult when I was watching, you know, to get kind of mixed up as to what it was all about. Like there was a mad, uncontrolled speculation, but that has largely worked its way through the system in the sense that, you know, land prices have dropped right down and there's been a huge rundown in the value of assets. But that's in the system now, and it's awful, and people are stuck with mortgages and so on. But it's in there, and it will gradually work its way out. A separate thing completely was a worldwide reduction in bank liquidity. Like there was this period then where you could go to any bloody bank in the world and they'd be happy to give you money at very modest interest rates. And of course what the idiots who did this didn't realise that they're looking for it back in a short time. Like Anglo-Irish Bank, their average loan to their developers was 8 years, right? They loaned out money for 8 years, and their average loan from the French and the German banks was what? 6 months. Now, I cannot believe that any engineer would look at a resource and say, I have a resource which I have to repay in 6 months, but I need it for 8 years, without realising that this just doesn't add up, you know. So that was the whole thing about the liquidity. It's virtually wiped out the Irish banks, but they will recover and they'll move on from there. The final thing then was the unsustainable expansion of government spending, which we're all suffering in terms of cutbacks and all the rest of it. And again, I don't know, there was nothing malicious in it. When you have money, you think you can spend it. But the problem is the government sector of the economy finds it much more difficult to make these adjustments. The commercial thing, like in our company, we have had 4 salary reductions without a murmur from anyone. We went, the whole lot of us, myself included in that, and we discussed with the staff and said, look, it's either jobs go or we reduce salaries, and everyone said, no, reduce salaries and we'll go on. And we've got through it. We haven't had any redundancies for the last 2 years and so on. But it's awful, but we're moving through that. So I'm saying that all 3 of these are operating to make us feel miserable. However, underneath the headlines, the real long-term economy has not reduced, but actually increased in areas of exports and so on. Like we would deal with a lot of companies who were in the export field. Like I mentioned Abbott Laboratories, but we've done an awful lot of work in the medical device field. And all down the west of Ireland, you have the whole crowd, and their exports are colossal. And they've been working away. They love the workforce, very sophisticated, well-educated workforce, and they have survived. And they are expanding like nobody did. But we don't see it. You don't see bloody cranes and sites and all the rest of it, but it's working away in the background. In our own case, the building industry, we have had an absolute bloodletting. I mean, it's now, and it's not pub talk, it's an actual simple fact. The turnover now is 15% of what it was in 2007. So it's dropped 85%, which is, it's almost impossible to see how we've carried on. But the export firms, such as the Hewlett-Packards, the Googles, the Microsofts, they are all planning growth in Ireland, and in many cases they're undertaking expansion. And there's bad news as well. Like, I mean, the difficulty in all economies is that even in a boom, there are companies closing down. If you take HMV, anyone, like I buy CDs, I'm nuts about music. None of my children buy CDs. None of them. They never buy CDs. They get it off the web. And I'm seeing this thing, you're absolutely right. HMV are doomed. So the point I'm making, companies are closing down for reasons to do with developments in the economy, not necessarily the recession. So in an economy that's doing well, companies are going up and companies are going down, but because more of them are going up than going down, you're not particularly conscious. When you get into this recession thing, all you see are the ones that are going down, but there are other ones coming up, and we've got to keep our eyes on that. Ireland is coming back, but the recovery will take time, and unfortunately it's going to be a tough market for you people. And I was then going to go on to talk to you about kind of two realistic options. But I got the Irish Times today, I wrote this a few days ago, and here's the headline, right? Rise in job figures signals the start of recovery. So the first increase in employment in Ireland has occurred, and it's been 4.5 dreadful, lousy years. So I'm not exaggerating it, I'm not saying that we've arrived in the promised land, but we're on our way, and we all need to work together and see what we can do. So what I think from your viewpoint, I would suggest, and this is only mine, that you have two kind of approaches, and one of them is what I call the first job seizure, and I consciously use the job seizure. You cannot relax. That first job is going to turn you from a terribly interesting person with a degree to someone who can make money for an employer. And that's so important. And it's not that employers are ghastly or whatever, but when you come out with your degree, you're great, but will you be able to make money for the company? So you've got to get into that first job. And I would say it's so important. At the moment, everyone in business is keeping down overheads, and an inexperienced undergraduate is a luxury, unfortunately. And it applies right across the board. So you must aim to get that first appointment and get out into the job market at all costs. So my advice would be get ruthless. Get the best position you can, and don't be fussy about the firm. Like, we all have our pecking order and the people we'd like to be with and so on. Once you've worked for 6 or 9 months, you've had a job, you've had experience, and then you can start going around picking and choosing or whatever. But I really would emphasize, get that first job at all costs. If your granny's going to leave you some money, you can beg her to give it to you in that year so that you can work for next to nothing. And I'd really say that, like, just to put this in context, and I know I get back a long way, but the first year that I worked was the first year that engineering graduates were paid. The first year. Prior to that, if you did your degree and you went into one of the consulting firms in Victoria Street in London or whatever, you paid them. I couldn't do it. I come from a working class family. We had no money or whatever. And by the grace of God, it had changed. But that was the attitude, that you're coming out as a trainee and you're not much use to the company and you pay them. So in a way, I know it sounds awful, but it puts it in context. You have to earn your way in. Once you get that job and you've had it under your belt, of course you can start to move up. The other option, which I'd like to talk to you about, is overseas work. I looked it up in the dictionary, and the word emigrate means to leave a country to settle, not to go and work in it or come back, to settle in another country. And it's a frightfully emotive phrase in Ireland. You see the bloody statistics, 50,000 young people have emigrated. They actually haven't. Some of them may emigrate, but a lot of them will go off and work for a couple of years, learn huge amounts of expertise, and come back and be an addition not only to themselves, but to the country. There was a study, I remember reading this Irish American, and he did a whole thing about immigration to the United States. And the only group of all the immigrants, Italians, Ukrainians, Jews, all the groups that came to the United States, the only group that ever used the word exile were the Irish. And his view was this was a deeply Celtic thing, where we're so attached to the land and location and so on. So it's quite an emotive kind of thing. And what I'm really saying is, if I could move on to the next one, is that to leave home for a period, to be educated or work abroad, it's a well-accepted phenomenon throughout the world, and I'd recommend it to you. You'll come back to an improving economy, and with experience, ideas, and knowledge of other cultures. In my own company in Bruce Shaw, we have completely orientated our business. We're now doing something like 70% of our business overseas. And I have to say, there's a young guy in the office, John Butler. He's 31 years of age, just got married. He's going off to a wonderful job in Sydney, to work on data centres in Sydney. He'll come back a very sophisticated engineer indeed. I mean, frankly, I wouldn't mind going there myself for 2 years, So, like, the point of making it, I do find it, I think it's awful if you're an unskilled person and you're forced to go off, as happened in the 50s in Britain, poor devils coming over and, being treated badly and so on. But there is an element of the people who are leaving where it's not bad news at all, it's good news. This will continue. Like, we are not going to go back to the good old days or the bad old days of 2005, 2006, 2007. We are going to be what we are, a terrific exporting company with a strong finger overseas. And we have a culture, we're linked to America and so on. We have all this, the Irish diaspora is a wonderful asset that we have. And that's the world we're going to live in forever. We have overseas work at the moment in Australia, in Israel, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Holland, US, and in fact, we had discussion, myself and Liam, met some people yesterday, we're talking about doing work now in Uganda and Kenya and Ghana. So all of that was abandoned. In the 1990s, we were all working overseas. We did a huge, one of my biggest clients was Saddam Hussein, wonderful man altogether. He paid his invoices, the Ministry of Supply paid the invoices on the dot. Now, unfortunately, as you know, the poor man was eventually hanged. And I debated at one point getting the video of his hanging, and then if any of our clients were a bit slow in paying us, send it through. I thought that was a bit tasteless, even though so what I'm really saying is, don't give up heart. There are surprisingly good people around, and you have now, and we'll learn even more, the precious gift of judgment. I think going off overseas is great. You jump in, you get quick promotion. People are under pressure and so on, and you find that you learn an awful lot very, very quickly. One of the other things, and I'd hate to say this to my English friends, but one of the huge pluses we have is we speak English, and English is it's the international language. So the irony of it is, if you go to the Middle East, all the people involved in manufacturing and industry and all, everyone has English. And you do not get people in the Middle East learning to speak Dutch, and it is a plus. No, I heard the other day a program, they were talking about young Spanish people, and their difficulty is they have a very low level, particularly they actually mention people with technical qualifications in Spain, that very few of them have learned English, which means that their overseas market is in fact fundamentally limited to South America, where we're in a completely different kettle of fish altogether. And the other thing is, don't worry, you won't be replaced by computers. The story's told that they had these translation computers, and you could put English into it, and they would translate it into different language and back out. So somebody put in the phrase "out of sight, out of mind," translated into Russian, then into French, and back into English, and it came out as "invisible idiot." So I will finish with just a short kind of comment about my own career. If you could turn over there. I mean, first of all, like all of you, I owe a huge amount to my parents and my family. I originally grew up in a working class housing estate in Newry. I went to the local Christian Brothers School. I did a degree in engineering at Queen's University, and then I worked in London with a big firm of contractors to qualify as a chartered engineer. And then I returned to university and I did a degree in architecture, which was quite interesting now. It's a different kind of emphasis. And I remember one night we were discussing group nouns, and we were kind of saying, what group noun would you apply to engineers? What would I say? I was giving a lecture in front of, and then we thought, a pride. I gave a lecture to a pride of engineers. So then somebody said, well then if that's the case, you need to use the word arrogance for architects. An arrogance of architects. So I joined then a firm in London, PA Management Consultants, and worked in the UK and in Dublin. And then I joined a large property company here in Dublin as their development director. And then I set up my own project management company in Dublin. And eventually we did a big job. Eventually extended that and opened in London. And then we did this fantastic job, which I'll talk about in a minute, for the Science Museum of London, for which I was awarded an OBE by Tony Blair. Don't mention Tony quite so much nowadays as I used to, you know. But we then merged with Bouchard in the year 2000, and fortunately, I'd have to say, we've survived the boom and the recession so far. So I just thought I should talk to you about like what has been for me the whole essence of the thing, and that's to work with wonderful people on wonderful jobs. And the two that I mentioned would be the Welcome Wing in the Science Museum in London, and the other one was the Convention Centre in Dublin. So I won't bore you with too much technical. But if you look at this building here, like only an architect could do it, in the sense that this huge curved thing here, which is hanging from the roof, is an IMAX cinema. The rest of us would put a cinema on the ground floor. But it was a terrific idea. And then what happened is all these exhibition floors were all suspended again. So when you went into the space, all you could see was this wonderful kind of structure, and then all these escalators and walkways and so on, all connecting to it. And I'd have to say it was fantastic. Within it, there were tremendous requirements in terms of automated controls. We ended up with putting in, quite a lot of sophisticated heat and power arrangements for saving on energy and so on. And they, in fact, became in the basement an exhibition in their own right. And the lighting controls had to be completely variable for all the different exhibitions. And of course, the structure made it great. It was very open to do this. And then in the IMAX cinema, the interesting thing is you're putting something in the middle of this where you have this incredible sound system in the IMAX cinema. So the sound insulation and so on was all linked. The air conditioning of the cinema was quite complicated because you could have quite variable, like very small numbers of people or very large. So it was a wonderful, wonderful building. And I'll just flick over and you can see this is on the ground floor. You look up at these wonderful exhibition floors. The museum spent a lot of time and a lot of money, if you could flick over to the next one, putting in a lot of these. You can't really see them that well, but they have all these exhibits, and they have like the human brain is one, the who am I is another, where you identify yourself with your fingerprints. You go in, and then all through the exhibit, when you put your hand down, it kind of says. So it's all interactive and very much linked, to computers and so on, and very appealing to young people. And they would have about 3 million visitors a year, and it has just been a wonderful, wonderful success. The next one then is the Convention Centre. It's quite interesting how the Beckett Bridge, which I think is a wonderful, beautiful design, which we weren't involved in, but the Beckett Bridge and the Convention Centre, they really have become an icon for Dublin now, more than the Spike. The Spike was just one of those kind of interesting ideas, but it's not photogenic, and therefore this has in effect taken over. So next one. So what you have is the Convention Centre was a very adventurous thing, and we all go on about the property boom and all the rest of it, but it was the Irish government and their agents, which were the OPW, which people would think is a rather mundane kind of organisation, but they come up with this wonderful idea of a world-class convention centre. And convention centres they're quite unusual. They make a lot of money for the city they are in and for the state, but very few of them make money. But the developer, who was Treasury, linked up with the National Exhibition Centre people in Birmingham, and they have a convention centre in Birmingham. It is the only convention centre in Europe that makes money. And they brought that kind of very north of England pragmatic kind of approach across. And what they've done is everything is worked like hell, like everything. So you have a whole series of seminar rooms, and they all have these fantastic folding partitions and so on. And you fold them back, and you can have 2 rooms, 3 rooms, so on, all the time. And as well as that, when you do that, the lighting controls move with it, and the audio-visual gear. They really have to make everything work to get as much money as you can out of the activities all the time. Now, in theory, you can take 15,000 people, but that would mean you'd have somebody in the lecture theatre and people in the seminar rooms. What tends to happen is somebody like the Law Society of America, when they take it over, they use the auditorium for lectures, and they have the seminar rooms when they break out. So it's more like 8,000 to 10,000 would be the number of people who would be involved in it. But like from the point of view of you guys, in terms of electronic engineering, mechanical engineering, and environmental engineering, it just was an incredible challenge and a wonderful compliment to the engineering profession in Ireland. The architects were a firm called Roche in New York, but in actual fact Kevin Roche is Irish. In fact, when he was a very young man, he did the Busaras building. So it was wonderful for him to come back and produce this. And personally, I think it's very successful. In this kind of whole area out front here with the escalators crisscrossing and so on, it's great. So it's a great achievement for all of us, and it is something, as I say, which will be of benefit, to the city and the state for the foreseeable future. Okay, we'll move then just to overseas. I was saying we're now doing 70% of our business overseas. That's both quantity surveying and project management. We'll show you a slide here of this hotel we're doing in Qatar, and then the Abu Dhabi International Airport, and we're in all these other places now as well, if you want to just put them down there. So I won't spend a lot of time on it, but just this is this incredible Qatar hospitality hotel. Not the design isn't finished yet, and it will eventually be built, but it's not built yet. But this is the kind of glamour job that we're now looking at. I personally don't know all the details of it, and the same with the Abu Dhabi International Airport. Now, it's still fraught. It's not a mad boom overseas, but there are things going ahead, and they are coming out of the recession just the same way we have ourselves, and there are opportunities. And we're very fortunate on the quantity surveying side that they can get a job in Qatar and do about 70% of the work in Ireland. So but with us on the project management side, no, you have to actually be there. But in case you think it's all glamour, right? Okay, this is the most recent job that I was involved in. I'm the chairman of the company, and I end up doing this. I'll be frank with you, a lovely little job. It's 6 little townhouses in Shepherd's Bush in London. And I think you must carry modesty with you in your life. You just can't get into this big-headed, I only deal with these kind of large jobs. I think it's important to keep your feet on the ground. I loved it. I loved that job. It was a small developer in Ireland, get into financial difficulties. The banks brought us in to help them to kind of finish the job. We did it. Everything was finished, and everything's been sold. And it's a very nice addition to the environment. So I'm just making that point. Don't always go for the big things. So in conclusion, if I could say, I think engineering is a great business to be in. Wilbur Wright, the inventor of the airplane with his brother Orville, described their interest in the project of powered flight by saying, when we worked, we could hardly wait to get up in the morning. That's what you want to be doing. You want to be looking forward to. You won't look forward to everything, that's it. But there are these times, and they make up for all the boring kind of times. And as I said, it's not all glamour. I'd also like to thank you for the time, and I hope it helped you in your thinking. And I would just like to recount one of my famous successes. I mean, I actually was the project manager for the Tala Hospital, and I think it's quite interesting that I'm now back with yourselves. And the story's told that President Robinson was being brought around the hospital by the matron, and the matron brought her into this ward, and it was all made up of men, and they were all lying on their side, and they were all groaning. And Mary Robinson said, matron, what exactly is this? She said, oh, it's the hemorrhoid ward, you know. And so the matron says, oh, I see. And then she said, excuse me, who's that chap up in the corner? You know, he's sitting up in bed and he's going like this. And the matron says, that's the project manager. He doesn't have his ass from his elbow.
That's a very nice talk, and some very nice, interesting facts there. I don't know if anybody has any questions they'd like to ask. Yeah?
I might just throw in, John, we have a room full of engineering students who are going to graduate pretty soon, and I'm just wondering if you have any words of wisdom for interview stage. Apart from the technical skills which all the engineers have, what else would you be looking for at interview stage?
Well, that's what I'm saying. I think one of the things is this business of personality. You know, you're expected to have the technical stuff, and you should talk about that and so on. But I think what's important is, at least if you find out from them, you know, don't be afraid to ask them questions, you know. And because what you'll find is that they have a view of the kind of person they want, and maybe someone who's very bossy, or maybe somebody who's very passive or whatever. And of course, you can't be different to yourself, but it certainly helps you. And I think in interviews, it's far better if you can get either from the information you give you beforehand or by asking them when you go in to get an idea of what they're looking for. And then face the facts. If it isn't in your arena or whatever, you may have to say, I don't quite fit into that, but maybe I can fit into another area or whatever. But the kind of blind kind of view putting forward, what you're saying without knowing on their side, I think is wrong. I think employers need to tell you the kind of thing they have in mind, the kind of challenges that may come up in the job. So that would be my advice, is find out from them at the interview and so on, what they're looking for.
I think that's good advice, all right. I remember my first interview, I went, when I graduated, I arrived in and I couldn't speak. So that was an experience I actually have never forgotten. But anybody else with any questions? I was interested in your point about the progression, an obvious progression from engineering into management, and do you think there's any specific characteristics after the education that the engineer gets that does make them?
That's what I'm saying. I think it's very methodical, and you generally speaking in engineering, and I can only talk about because I'm involved obviously in the building industry and so on. But you find that for example, in architecture, and I did a course in architecture myself, but cost is not a factor that's particularly considered. The whole idea is to get drama and excitement and all that. Where I think engineers always carry that sense of practicality with them. Will we be able to afford it? And I think that's the kind of characteristic that comes out in management. But I do emphasise it isn't every engineer who'll be a great manager. It depends on the type of person you are. But I think it's a very good basis for it. And if you find that in your career you've tended in that direction, go off and do a course in it. And like nearly everyone I think in our office, project management has done a postgraduate course in project management. They were all engineers originally, and then they did mainly in Trinity. So it happens. It's mostly Trinity. No, I think it's a very, very good. I found architecture was a fantastic cultural education. Quite a different kind of thing. It opened your mind out and so on. But engineering, really, the lessons you learn, you'll never forget them the rest of your life. You approach problems in the same kind of way all the time.
Yeah. I think I might be safe to say that most of the students here, when they do if you were to take a look at their curriculum or their modules that they sit, and they look at the management and the project management modules, and they actually perhaps don't treat them with the same regard that they might engineering and graphics, and I think maybe you could tell them that actually maybe they need a second look at that.
Well, that's to say, it's one of the, your difficulty is like, I would be the same as much as when I was an undergraduate too. It's only when you move on that and we're all the same. You learn things at school even and at university, and then actually, in fact, you don't use them until many years later. But certainly, I think you must bear in mind that you will be doing this further education. So therefore, these other topics are something you should look at. Not just the ones that you really kind of like and enjoy. And certainly the management thing. Even if you're the professional perfectionist as an engineer, knowing about management so on helps you, to see things in context. As to like I'm a great believer in power goes to those who exercise it. So when you deal with organisations, one of the great characteristics is to find out who gets things done, and it tends to be engineers.
Yeah.
And it's quite interesting how it's changed. I remember the top 100 companies in the UK, something like 25 years ago, 80 of them or 85 of them had gone to Oxford and Cambridge. Now it's only 10. It's like it's a much more of a meritocracy now, and things are much more open. And I think that's all to the good. So therefore, whatever you get in your course that can help you in the future is something to be, to take seriously.
Yes, indeed. Because I would concur. And one of the studies that was done for graduates of the institutes, for instance, the heads of schools of engineering had a study produced basically questionnaires of graduates. Somebody maybe graduated 2 or 3 years. And one of the most important aspects they cited was this idea of communications and the soft skills that they felt were very important when they hit the ground running in industry. So it's, at the time when they were in doing their courses, that didn't appear to be the more important ones. But when they found out later on that having to work in a team and having to manage a team, you needed quite different skills, which they appreciated later in life. Yeah.
Yeah, I know this sounds, and it's not because I know you obviously have foreign students here, but we're very fortunate in Ireland that the culture in Ireland kind of rewards charm. You know, people tend not to be rude. I mean, I worked in Belgium, and I have nothing but the highest regards for the Belgian people who are frightfully professional, very, very able. But it's not a society where charm stands as a very significant factor. And you tend to get people, you say to people, did you like what they did? They consider you know it was absolutely hopeless. You know this. So, but the point I'm making is the modern world is much more into this kind of, yes, that wasn't too bad, but maybe you could improve it a bit. You know, that's more, you have to be more careful nowadays. And I think we're very fortunate as a culture that that kind of thing is there. So you do find that when we go overseas that we are seen to be people who can work in an environment where difficulties arise and we're able to handle conflict, you know, without letting it get out of hand.
Yeah, I think I found when I went to England, when I graduated and I worked in the UK, one thing I found was I thought everybody was like the Irish. When I arrived, I worked with English people. I discovered they were quite different in the way that we interacted, and it took me quite a while maybe to break down and communicate with them like I would an Irish person. They were a bit more formal about things, but it was a good learning experience for me then, because I learned how to. I did my communication skills were really good, my social skills, I think. Yeah.
That's why I think the Learn to Learn module on the engineering courses is fantastic, because it teaches you actually think about your own thinking with their metacognition. So I think that's a really important part of the
Very good.
Just I think I'd be very impressed by the fact that you were coming here to speak to a college where we do mechanical engineering, electronic engineering, and you went and you researched the marketplace at the moment in those disciplines. But just to point out, in case people were very dismayed by your comments about environmental engineering and the prospects for environmental engineers at the moment, our program is actually energy and environmental, and the emphasis is more on the energy. So just to get your view maybe on the you know, I mean, there's so much work going on at the moment, energy being a very major focus of investment, even in these hard times. Just get your view of
well, absolutely, yeah. No, I must say, I'm sorry, I didn't realise that nuance, you know, about the course. But no, you're quite right. Like the whole energy thing, I think there is a gap between aspiration and our ability to spend money, you know, which is the same, you know, it's right across the board. But like certainly it is a very promising area, there's no question about it. And we're all so much more interested, and rightly so, in the environment, you know, and the whole energy kind of thing. It's no, it would be, we would be very conscious now on buildings, but as a fact, we're not doing many buildings at the moment, so therefore, you know, there isn't that. That's what I was saying in terms of the environmental engineering thing. But certainly in manufacturing and right across the board, you know, there has to be. I mean, I mean, one of the things we would do, we've done quite a number of 5-star hotels, and good God, like they are the most energy wasteful institution, you know, that themselves in hospitals. I don't mean that it's bad to waste, you know what I mean, but they operate, you know, 7 days a week and effectively 24 hours a day type of thing, and there just hasn't been the interest in making them more energy efficient that there should be, you know? And where oddly enough, in things like offices, which are less of a problem, like all the staff are like yourselves, they're all young people, and they're very keen and they'll back this, you know. If we come up with ideas, you know, where, you know, there will be a reduction in light levels, some staff are all for it, you know. And I think that's great. I think that change in outlook is wonderful.
Question?
You're working as a cement about oil industry. What do you think of opportunities Irish engineers or Irish students in cementing, drilling overseas?
In doing what?
Oil industry.
Oil industry.
As a drilling, cementing.
Yeah, well, they're certainly there. I mean, we're working with Tullow Oil as it happens, and that's where we're doing more. We're not on the oil side of it, but it is a specialist area. Frankly, I wouldn't pretend to know much about it. And my impression of the oil industry, which I would have gotten out of the UK, because of its international nature, you end up with this kind of like roving. All the engineers that I knew in the oil industry were prepared to kind of travel from here to Vladivostok and back at the drop of a hat. You know, I think you have to have that ability to move around. You know, but again, it is another area, and the pressure now is on to get oil from more difficult kind of areas, you know, and gas.
Very good. Anybody else? Okay, we wrap it up. I'd like to thank John very much for coming here today. I'd like to thank Susan for all the AV facilities, which